and view it. So with that, would like to welcome everyone to our third webinar session in place of our conference that we normally hold in Whangarei, and would like to welcome John Roche. Now, John was our science manager, or not manager, but advisor from Dairy NZ, helping us in our trials, and then he progressed up to MPI as a Chief Advisor, I suppose would be the correct term, John, to the government. So we thought John has always given us some great sessions in our field days and conference, and certainly welcome John coming back, and look forward to your discussion tonight, John.
Excellent. I'm just sharing my screen there. Can everybody see it?
Not yet.
Yep.
Cool. It's come up, I think, Terence. No.
Yep.
Look, thank you for that. Thank you for the invite first, and thanks for the introduction, Terence. It's great to be here, even if it is virtually, and hopefully in the not too distant future, I'll actually get up to see what you guys are at in Dargaville again as well. But look, this is it's an interesting topic, and it's been made even more interesting, obviously, by the tragic events in Eastern Europe over the last week to 10 days. And I think I had pulled most of my slides together before that happened, before that happened is probably the best way of putting it. And but I think I'm quite happy to discuss what are the potential implications of that after as well. I might touch on them as I go through. So, look, without further ado, many of you who have seen me speak before, if I can get this thing to work, will have seen me, will have heard me say this slide. And I think as we go through the next 30 to 40 minutes, it'll become apparent.
Not bad, eh?
I think there's somebody not on mute, but anyway, I'll keep talking. I can do that. It'll become apparent that this is the truth, still the truth, and will continue to be the truth, I think, because the challenge facing us as humanity is enormous. This is the amount of food that we have to produce, or that the human race has had to produce since the year zero. And to put that in context, we have to produce as much protein in the next 30 years as we did in the last 2,000 years, which sounds like an astronomical challenge. In fact, I heard yesterday, I saw somebody else say something similar to this yesterday, where we have to produce as much food in the next 30 years as we did in the last 10,000 years. And that's probably about right as well, when you think of where this graph was at back at the time of Christ on this. So it's an extraordinary goal to set ourselves, and for the first time, there's no more land. There's no more land, which has been a huge part of us increasing food production in previous situations where it's been needed. But as well as that, there's a reluctance among our wealthiest nations on earth to use the technologies that are available to us. And that is also the first time that has occurred. So when you think about it, the Green Revolution of the 1960s was largely driven by a genetic revolution, a breeding of short-strawed varieties of cereals, and particularly rice in Asia. But I'm sure any of you who've talked to your parents and grandparents about growing wheat or barley prior to the 1960s, and the size of the straw, the length of the straw, and the risk of lodging in rainfall events in early autumn was extraordinary. So genetic technologies drove the Green Revolution, and yet there's a real aversion to the use of modern genetic technologies in most of the world's wealthy markets. And then we've got this contradiction, as well as having to produce all of this food. And we do have, shy on 1 billion people that are hungry, that need food. We also have approximately 2 billion people that are obese, overweight, malnourished, for what we call the hidden hunger. So lacking in micronutrients and overnourished with particularly highly processed carbohydrates. So we've got this balance, or this balance skew, I suppose is a better way of putting it, that needs to be addressed as well. And then, you know, a week ago, the bottom left of my slide was my entire slide. And then I decided, well, there's another thing that is having a massive impact on food production, food availability, food security. So COVID taught the world, or made a lot of people in the world realize that food doesn't actually come out of a refrigerator. And when there's a disruption to the cycle of food distribution, etc., it also doesn't come out of a supermarket. And so people became acutely aware that food was scarce, food was precious, certainly during the early days of the pandemic. During lockdowns, of course, people went from a fairly significant part of their budget being spent on dining out and buying takeaways to having to prepare meals at home. And actually, by all consumer and social research that I've seen, taken a liking to it. And so a shift away from easy to prepare meals back to wholesome, nourishing foods that help our immune system, help us fight off contagious diseases, etc. So COVID has certainly changed that consumer landscape a little bit, and I'll talk some about that. But then obviously in the last week to 10 days and the tragedy that's unfolding in Eastern Europe and for the people of Ukraine, this has both immediate and fairly significant, at least medium term and quite possibly long-term consequences for the availability of food, food security, and the availability of different types of food, and certainly for global dairy production as well, which we can touch on later. So if we look at where are we at now, well, supply side is steady. When you look, and this of course predates the last week as well, I won't keep saying that, but all the statistics that we have available to us predate what's happened in Ukraine in the last week. World milk production is steady, increasing slightly, but on the whole steady. And here down in the southern hemisphere is just been steady for the last 2 to 3 years. You know, when we look at that from a New Zealand perspective, we broke all the records last year with a really good climatic year relative, in particular, to the year before, and a reasonable milk price. A bad winter and inflation challenges this year is certainly forecasting a lower milk production this year. It'll be interesting to see what we can do in the autumn, but as all of you guys know, this is largely set earlier in the year, and so although the slide might not be as great as this projection is suggesting, I can't see it rising up to where we did last year. And of course, again, this is not news to you, but the actual price of our product has gone to places where many of us only dreamt of. And I suppose if you look back through time, there is a significant difference in this lift in milk price. So if you look at the 2013 milk price boom, it was very heavily driven by skim milk and whole milk powder. The fat products were nowhere near as much in demand. And we had a very good, you can see the green line in the middle. I'm not sure if you can see my slide, my mouse, sorry, but this green line in the middle is the actual average GDT milk price through that time, but very heavily driven by whole milk powder and skim milk powder. Whereas we've got a very similar GDT price now, and obviously expanding beyond that at the moment, very heavily driven by fat, but also with whole milk powder and skim milk powder rising to very high levels in the last couple of weeks as well. And certainly the demand side of the equation is very different to what we saw at this stage. There doesn't seem to have been hoarding. We are looking at a different situation with oil. So we saw a collapse in the oil price at this stage, despite the annexing of Crimea. And of course, Russia putting counter sanctions on Europe, and therefore putting all of Europe's trade, dairy trade with Russia onto the world market, all led to this collapse in milk price that we saw. Europe has never gone, I'm not sure where Russia has been getting its dairy products from. That's kind of difficult to ascertain for anybody. They've obviously got a very large dairy economy themselves, but it wasn't Europe stepping back in to supply Russia. So we're not looking at European milk coming back on to flood the market as on the back of what we're currently seeing. Oil price is obviously very high, and for any of you who've watched those associations over the last decades, there's a really strong correlation between the price of oil and the price of milk protein, and so that's fueling a high milk price as well. And of course, we've got a growing population, and I will talk some about the change in consumer demands as well as we go on. So although we might see that slight downturn this year, you know, we are seeing a projection for an even greater revenue out of the dairy industry this year than we saw last year, which was a record revenue. And obviously, farmer milk prices are no secret to you guys. And of course, the forecast for next year is equally desirable. And again, all of the indications are that might actually be conservative. So just very, very quickly, I won't spend long on this because I want to leave lots of time for questions and discussion at the end. But this is just to show you that the trends in Northland have been very, very similar to the trends that we've seen nationally. So anything that I've just said applies to Northland equally to what it applies to New Zealand. Now, painting the Pollyanna moment there of high milk prices, and I'm always conscious of that, as many of you will know, having talked to me in the past. You know, I grew up in Ireland in the 1970s, where Irish dairy farmers were promised a high price for milk from then to eternity, and an unlimited market for their milk. And within 10 years, we were in a milk quota situation with a stagnant milk price, and as all of you are aware, inflation eroding any competitive base that we had. That said, we are in a very different world at the moment, and certainly the outlook looks good. And so, but we are facing challenges. All of you guys know this far better than I. You know, the last 2 years, again, if my mouse is showing up, which I hope it is, these last 2 years of inflationary pressures have been unprecedented. Prior to that, we saw, certainly in 07, 08, we saw a big step up in the price and the use of supplementary feeds, and that lifted our average cost of producing milk. But other than that, it was very much, you know, linear increases, bumps up and down, fertilizer following the price of oil, etc. But in the last 2 years, we've seen this massive shift, and particularly in the second two quarters of last year, and what we're witnessing in the first quarter of this year. You know, there is no one of our costs that is not more than 15 to 20% more now than it was 10 years ago. And some of them, this is dairy grazing, stock grazing at the top, is at 50 to 60% more expensive than it was 10 years ago. And the vast majority of that increase in expense is off the back of the 2020 dry summer. So again, like I said, I don't have to tell you guys about this, you live it day to day. One of our other challenges that we always talk about is a huge amount of our product is going into a really small number of markets. So 42% of our current dairy exports by value go to China. And yep, there's certainly a risk to that. You know, everyone knows that. Fonterra is working hard. Our international team are working hard to see what other markets are out there to be grown. So this is what we do for a living, or some of the people in the ministry do for a living. It's what your milk companies do for a living, and so they're doing their best to manage this risk. But it's there, and we need to acknowledge it, particularly again when you look at what's happening around the world now. But importantly, again, back to my Pollyanna moment, consumers want our stuff, and this is something. So I wanted to spend a couple of minutes on these slides because I don't believe you hear this often enough, and it's not that it's a secret. It's just that when you pick up the paper, you actually hear the opposite. So if you look at the demand, the retail market value for dairy as a whole, this is milk. I'll come to dairy as a whole in a second. Dairy milk is valued, the retail market is valued about 133 billion. Alternatives to milk, so they're your plant-based milks, have a market of approximately 12% of the, I realize you guys are going to scowl at me, but the liquid dairy market. I've deliberately said they're not alternative milks. I didn't know what to call them because they're not milk substitutes from a nutritional perspective, which is what I focus on. but they're what the markets treat as alternatives to milk. But they're forecasted to grow at a very similar amount, 5% versus 6%. But dairy milk is growing from 133 billion. The alternatives are growing from 19 billion. And you know, Peter might have talked to you about this 2 weeks ago if you were able to tune in. That market for the alternatives to milk is very insular. When one alternative grows, it tends to eat the share of another alternative. So that's the reason why, although you can see things like rice milk and a few other, rice juice, a beverage, and a few other things growing, they're usually growing at the expense of one of the other plant-based juices. So they are growing. They're growing at a relatively steady amount, around 6% a year from a small base. But if you look at dairy milk, it is still going to be the king across the world from a protein nutrition perspective. Now, if we look at total dairy, the story is even better. So we're talking about it growing from approximately $400 billion of revenue at 5% a year to 2026, 460 billion. So adding another 80 billion of value in the retail market for dairy. The alternatives to dairy growing slower from a smaller base, less than 10% of current revenue. I will come back to this in a second. I'm not suggesting for a second that there aren't opportunities for New Zealand Inc. to gain value out of some of these plant-based juices. And I'm not suggesting for a second that we shouldn't be aware as a dairy industry of how those products are actually growing. But I just wanted to put that up in perspective for you. You may well have seen it from your last two speakers anyway. Asia is our predominant growth market, as you can see. It's still growing in Europe, but fairly stagnant in North America and the Middle East and Africa, growing, but growing from a small base. So Asia is still the huge market for growth in dairy and milk in particular. And for those of you that also raise the odd bull, the trend is very similar for red meat. You know, 63 million tons traded in the retail market, forecast to grow at 2 to 3% per year. You know, so that by 2026 we'll have increased that again by 10%. Meat alternatives, you know, again, I realize that term might infuriate some of you, but bear with me for that one. You know, a really small part of the volume, forecast to grow quite a lot, but growing from a small amount to 1.1 million. So still less than 2% of total meat protein consumption, we call it that. Now, like I said, that wasn't meant to suggest, well, shit, we can forget about this. So we are on a trailblazing to the moon here. If you look at the amount of money that's being invested in these alternatives, it is absolutely mind-blowing. So plant-based companies for meats, eggs, and dairies, those alternatives to them, between 1980 and 2020, over 40 years, there was approximately $4.4 billion invested. In 2020 alone, $2.2 billion were invested in that. So there is a large amount of investment going into this. As I said to you before, this doesn't concern me. In the next 30 years, we have to produce as much protein as we did in the last 2,000 years. As far as I'm concerned, we will need every scrap of protein that we can get our hands on as a species in the next 30 years. But it does raise the question, where do we want our products going? What do we want to be remembered for? And that's what I want to touch on now. So what does the consumer say? I want to just keep going on this positive story for a few seconds. So this is a survey done by our economic intelligence unit inside at MPI. We've got a small unit that reaches out into the consumer marketplace to try and keep us aware of what's happening out there so that we can be better informed, to help you guys be better informed, and we can meet our market demands. But so there's a comparison there of consumer awareness and consumer comfort in their own knowledge of those different beverages that I've talked about before. And without exception, dairy leads the way in terms of awareness, but more importantly, leads the way in that consumers think they know a lot about it. Now, I'm going to come back to this in a second because this is a twin-edged sword. But for the moment, what that says to you is people have confidence in dairy as a food, confidence in its quality, confidence in its nutrition delivery, confidence in its safety in the way that we produce it, process it, and deliver it to them. So that's a really positive story. To break that down, and I mean, like as many of you know, I drink about 2 liters of milk a day, much to my doctor's annoyance, and so I can sit in that green section of that left bar. It's my favorite beverage. You know, there's very few people, or very few of the people surveyed in this said they didn't like milk. Whereas when you look across of the other alternatives to milk, the nut-based beverages, there's very few people. It's really balanced. So very few people will say that it's their favorite. But if you take that and it's the one I like, you're getting close to 50%. But there's also a greater number of people that don't like it. Now, again, when you consider the amount of money I just talked about that's being invested in these things, the things that consumers don't like about them can be overcome. So that gritty taste from drinking soy milk or soy juice that you don't get from dairy, it doesn't take a lot of investment to put us in a place where that will be overcome. So again, don't want to urge complacency here, but just to point to the fact that we have a really strong consumer demand for our products. But I want to come back to the consumer. So let's talk about ethical considerations. So I mentioned this earlier, that people feel they're really aware of dairy, they know where it comes from, and they know a lot about it. Well, there was an experiment undertaken in Canada. This is going back 2016, so probably going back 10 years. And at the University of British Columbia. And what they did was they brought in a bunch of people from Vancouver and asked them questions about dairy farming. And most of them got it wrong, all the questions wrong. They had no idea about dairy farming. And then they were asked to fill in this questionnaire. And as you can see, almost half of them were confident that dairy cattle have a good life. 30% of them were neutral. So you could say that 70% of them certainly weren't against us. And then there's approximately a third of them weren't confident in that statement. And then the researchers explained how we produce milk in Vancouver. Okay, so cows inside in barns, calf drops, calf is taken away from its mother, doesn't see it again, etc., etc. All of the things that we take for granted. And then they ran this survey again. And what they found was they lost half of the people that were confident that dairy cattle have a good life. So the reason I'm putting this up there is to highlight that people believing that they know dairy farming is a twin-edged sword, because when they find out something that they don't like and they don't know, they fall either into that neutral category or that not confident category. I would imagine that not many people move from the not confident into either the neutral or the confident in this survey. So just putting it up there. So let's talk about consumers. This was a survey that was done back 10 years ago now, but I couldn't find an updated one from Deloitte on this. But what it showed you was that a third of consumers actually believed that the purpose of business was to improve society. Now, importantly, those countries where that was stated are in Southeast Asia, either our biggest market or our growing market, and in Europe, an incredibly important market to us. Certainly, there was a third of respondents in South Korea and South Africa that the purpose of a business was to generate a profit. And there was a third suggesting that it was to drive innovation. So, but what it showed for probably, maybe not the first time, but an increasing amount, that consumers believe that that business could not be just about profit or products. It had to be about improving society. To use the old Teddy Roosevelt quote, no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. So to put that in perspective, this was a survey done last year across 35 countries. And on the ethical claims that drive purchasing decisions, and approximately 3/4 of consumers considered ethics when they were purchasing their products. I'll come back to whether that's true or not, or they're just saying it. And then when we look at it in New Zealand, it wasn't much different. You know, it was slightly less than 70%, but you know, you wouldn't drive a car through the two of those results. So approximately 70% of consumers, whether they're in New Zealand, whether they're overseas, think about ethics in their shopping decisions. Well, what does that mean? Well, there's a whole range of ethical and environmental priorities in those markets, including here. But if you look at them, high animal welfare standards is right up there. Protecting water was right up there. Supports nature conservation is right up there. It does, whether it's in New Zealand or overseas. And importantly, supporting the worker and supporting the farmer was up there in both. Third from the top in the New Zealand consumer. So again, I think important, the last message there is an important one because we don't often hear it. We read newspaper clippings that criticize dairy farming, but the vast majority of New Zealand consumers actually believe that farmers are doing a good job, could potentially be doing a better job, but are doing a good job, and I think we can build on that. If we look at the public perception survey of New Zealand, it says that, you know, it's a survey of how New Zealanders perceive the state of the country's natural environment. There's, you know, this is done every 3 years, and the most recent one and the one before that, the consumer was very concerned about climate change, and I think we need to be aware of that as we think about our products and our carbon footprint. Notably, though, farming was perceived to be one of the 3 main causes of damage to fresh water. I think, again, we need to recognize that. But for the first time in the survey's 20-year history, there was a decline in the proportion of New Zealanders that were citing it as an issue. So maybe a twin-edged sword there. People think that water quality isn't as bad maybe as it was in the past, but still recognizing farming to be a contributing factor in water degradation. So I think we need to be aware of that. So let me come back to the consumers. Look, those of us that are, you know, a little bit short in the follicles and long in the tooth tend to be very flippant about some of these younger consumers. You know, we slag them off for their gluten-free water and their gluten-free air. I think we are foolish if that's where we pitch ourselves, because these are the consumer of today, and they will be the large consumer of tomorrow. And when you look at the surveys of global sustainable investment, and you look at the surveys of consumers can be split really into 2 types. Those that are value driven, as in they want to buy something that's good value, and those that are values driven, those that want to buy things that align with their own personal values. And in this survey in 2019 from the IBM Institute for Business Value, they were equal in size. 80% of consumers fitted into either value or values driven. And why I think that's really important for New Zealand is I think we have the opportunity to capture both of them, because we produce some of the highest quality foods in some of the most natural way, and we do it at some of the lowest costs in the developed world. So we can meet all of these needs, and we can capture these consumer markets, in my opinion. Second point, though, I think it's important on this slide is that there's been a huge uptick in the amount of money that's being invested in sustainable products, in sustainable investment. It's up 68% since 2014, so up 70% in just under 10 years, and it's up 1,000% in 20 years. So there's an extraordinary increase in the amount of money that's being invested in sustainable products. And when we look at the growth of these products in the marketplace, the top line are the products that are marketed as being sustainable. And they've got a 5-year compound annual growth rate of around 4.5%. That's compared with the conventional, so the products that are not marketed as sustainable, having a CAGR of less than 1%. So they're growing almost 5 times faster than, sorry, the sustainable products are growing almost 5 times faster than the conventional products. That's quite significant. And just to show you what these sustainability marketed products are, they're largely the food products. So in that right-hand box, greater than 18% of the products in that category are marketed as sustainable. Our dairy, our yogurt, our cheeses, they all sit in that category. So they're marketed as being sustainable. And that is the highest growth market. So that's, as I said, twin-edged sword, huge opportunity for growth, but we need to be absolutely sure that we are doing the right thing from an ethics point of view. As I said to someone a couple of days ago, look, when your son or daughter goes off to university and they bring back their soy latte swilling vegan boyfriend or girlfriend, is there anything on your farm that you would be concerned about them seeing? That's the benchmark that you really want to measure yourself by. So, two roads diverge in the woods. And I think this is where we are at in New Zealand. Now, this isn't meant to be scary, because all it's suggesting is that there needs to be a balance between economic growth and environmental sustainability. And I have never, I think I can say never, but very rarely anyway, met a farmer that wouldn't agree with that statement. It doesn't matter where I've been in the world. And what we're naming that as, and I'm really glad I'm not in Whangarei in front of you for this, because I would imagine there'd probably be a couple of rotten tomatoes thrown at me. What we're calling that is regenerative agriculture. So don't hang up yet. I want to explain what we mean by that. So what is regenerative agriculture? Look, I've never come across two words that cause such an apoplectic reaction among farmers and scientists. They either love it and can't get enough of it, or they hate it and believe anyone that utters those two words should be, sent packing, basically. So I think, and I think that's the misinterpretation, misconception of what does regenerative agriculture mean for New Zealand. So let's look at what it means in general, what people think about overseas when they talk about regenerative agriculture. So they talk about principles and practices. They talk about rebuilding soil organic matter, restoring degraded soil and soil biodiversity. They talk about increasing carbon, reducing the impact of agriculture on climate change, enhancing biodiversity, improving the filtration system of the soil so that we capture more nutrients, we don't lose as many nutrients, and overall enhancing ecosystem services. Now, when I started looking at this 2 years ago, I saw all of this confusion, all of this diversity of opinion, all of the anger. And so what I did was I pulled together what I call the technical advisory group of farmers and growers, scientists, Maori that are really steeped in farming and Mataranga Maori and managing the land, and some marketing and business people. So I pulled those together to decide, what does this mean for New Zealand? Because those definitions are not good enough for New Zealand. The reason they're not good enough for New Zealand is we know we're a country with some of the highest soil carbon yields in the world. We have 3 times, on average, 3 times the amount of carbon in our soils to Australia. Now, it's probably an unfair comparison, considering 80% of the large island to our west is desert and hasn't had that same opportunity that New Zealand has. But even globally, we have 50% more than the global average. And that's because of our traditional pastoral-based systems. And so we have a really large amount of carbon stored in our soils. We're not representative of the countries that really drove the regenerative agriculture movement around zero till and that type of farming practices. But we do have our own challenges. So why not use the word regenerative anyway? Some of our challenges, look at it from a dairy perspective. You know, we do produce, and I'm sure you've heard this, we do produce some of the lowest carbon dairy products in the world. Even when you account for the carbon footprint of transport to our markets, we still have a really low carbon footprint in our dairy products. But our dairy industry has more than doubled its carbon footprint in the last 30 years. So that's something that doesn't speak to regenerative in the consumer's mind. Our water quality, again, depends on which catchment you're in, and I don't want to stand too much on this. It's just an example to put up there. Is that in a survey of all of the catchments being surveyed regularly in New Zealand, total nitrogen between 1990 and 2015, total nitrogen had increased in 42% of them, nitrate had increased in a third of them, and conductivity had increased in 2/3 of them. They were primarily lowland rivers, as you would know, and the strongest correlation was with the number of dairy cattle in the catchment. So we have our own problems. So what we did as a technical advisory group is try to define what does regenerative mean for New Zealand. And we came up with a term that a large hui of 150 people, some of you may well have been at it, from all over the country, farmers, growers, scientists, everyone that was interested got together last April and agreed on a vision for regenerating Aotearoa, regenerating New Zealand. And the vision is a set of primary sector principles and practices that in isolation or collectively result in improved outcomes for our productive landscapes, rivers, coastal and marine environments, biodiversity and natural ecosystems and animal welfare, promote health and well-being for humans and animals, and ensure we can grow and consume our food and fiber products sustainably. So I presented that all over the country. I presented that at Fed Farmers Primary Sector Conference last year and talked to a number of farmers afterwards. And the only thing that's missing that I need to address with this, I need to go back to the group. It's actually in there, but it doesn't stand out as being in there. Is farmer profitability has to be front and center of that as well. And it was implicit in farmer well-being that they also have to be profitable. But the more people I've talked to, the more that have said you need to pull that out of it. So there is subtle changes that need to be made to this. But when I've talked with people that don't like the term regenerative agriculture about this vision, the general comment I get back is, well, who the heck could argue with that? All right, just to finish off, what that means to me is that farmers should be recognized for the practices that achieve those outcomes. So I should have said, you can see that this is an outcome-driven vision. It is what we all want to achieve. And any practice that goes towards achieving those practices, those outcomes, should be regarded as regenerative practices. And so farmers should be recognized. You know, the arable farmers that are using minimum and no-till farming methods, cover crops, etc., to avoid loss of nutrients and avoid carbon loss, etc., that should be recognized as a regenerative practice. Rotational grazing is rightly recognized as a regenerative practice. Fencing waterways, riparian planting native species. You've all, I would presume, the vast majority you certainly will have, could probably list off a dozen of regenerative practices that immediately spring to mind. And I borrowed a phrase from one of my Maori colleagues in our agribusiness team, that what we're describing is a continuous improvement on a journey to revitalize Papatūānuku, to revitalize the planet. And we can lead the way. The market is certainly open to us leading the way, and we have good information on that. Work that was done by Beef and Lamb New Zealand and Wine New Zealand, part funded by MPI, showed that our wealthy consumers like the term regenerative agriculture, but they don't know what it means. So the opportunity is there for us to tell them what it is by selling New Zealand's story. So I'll go back to my slide in the middle. One of my favorite poems growing up was by Robert Frost, "Two roads diverged in the woods, and I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference." I believe that's where we are. We have a choice. we know that we need to be on a pathway to more sustainable, higher value products. And I'm sure Peter McBride talked with you 2 weeks ago about the work that Fonterra is doing in that space. And it's, it's fantastic, and many of our other primary sector bodies are working very, very hard in that space as well. Or alternatively, we can resist that change and try and continue the race to the bottom with high greenhouse gas footprints, poor water quality, etc. But we will meet massive regulatory resistance, massive consumer resistance, and in the end, we won't be better off. So that's the road I'm thinking of. And look, I just want to leave you with a thought. And again, some of you will have heard this because I don't have that many thoughts, so I tend to regurgitate them a lot. Like I as a nutritionist, the best piece of dietary advice I was ever given was, if you want to manage your weight, which I've been completely ineffectual at, stick to the outside aisle of the supermarket. You walk, and I'm just imagining my supermarket now as I walk you through this. You walk in to the fresh fruit and vegetables right in front of you. You then have the meat, fish, chicken, and then you're down the ice cream and dairy, cheese, etc. And you finish off over in the far corner in the alcohol aisle. And you've got a perfectly balanced diet. You avoid the inside aisles of the supermarket. Where we've got a badge of honor is we produce the outside aisle of the supermarket. We produce wholesome food that the world wants. Our future is very bright. The question is, do we want to meet our future in a positive way? Terence, I'm going to leave it at that, and happy to take any questions, comments, criticisms. Floor is open. I'll stop sharing my slides so that you can see me too.
Thanks for that, John. You've certainly kept your standard of presentation, so highly interesting and very comforting to consider that food is becoming such an important aspect of people's lives going into the future. We saw the impact with COVID, and now we're seeing the impact with Russia and Ukraine. And I've always considered those thoughts alongside the impacts of the environmental challenges that we face and the impact that will have on production. So yeah, that creates some interesting dynamics going forward. So thanks, and I'll hand over to Kim now to ask some of the questions that have come through. So you go for it, Kim.
Yep. Thank you, John. We've missed your quotes. I've got a few new ones there. Oh, sorry, the outside aisle of the supermarkets just had me in stitches, so I've got to collect myself. But good question from Alison. Those surveys about the consumer drivers, which the value and values, how often do they get done? And do you see those trends changing over time, or do you see them staying equal?
Oh no, we have certainly seen them change over time. So they're done regularly by consumer groups. So they're probably done by, if you took one group like Nielsen's, probably once every 5 years. I'm picking a number now, but it's not once every 20 years, and they certainly don't do it every year. But there's many different groups doing those surveys, and without a shadow of a doubt, over the last 20 years, we have seen quite a significant shift in consumer attitudes to buying ethically, either from an environmental sustainability or from an animal welfare perspective. Now, where that's often misconstrued is people say that, and therefore, and then it doesn't bear out when they go into the supermarket. It actually does, but it's not the number one reason why someone buys something. So the consumer, our most recent market research, which was that work that Beef and Lamb and Wine New Zealand did on regenerative agriculture, was first and foremost, people buy on taste. So do I enjoy to eat it? Now, once you've picked the product that you're going to buy, whether that's a steak or a bunch of bananas, you then start thinking, did that steak come off a feedlot? Again, depending on a person's viewpoint on this, or did it come off an organically grown pasture, or did the bunch of
Go and
bananas,
talk to Dad.
you know, did the bunch of bananas come from an ethically harvested banana plantation, things like that. So it may not be the first thing that decides what a person buys, but it is increasingly up the list. Now, where the hesitation arises on this, Kim, is the price of food has been declining for 70 years. People's wages against that have been increasing. And so, you know, when our parents and grandparents or parents were young, you know, 50%, if not 60% of their discretionary income was spent on food. So the idea of choosing within food groups on what they were going to buy was generally on price, and not on whether it was ethically produced. In fact, I mean, they probably hadn't really had those same conversations that we're having now. Not that that's wrong or right. I'm just saying they probably didn't have it. With what's happening, with what's happened with COVID and supply disruptions and the ability to get food to places, that's certainly been a problem the last 2 years, certainly been a headache for many of our food manufacturers and distributors for the last 2 years. But now what's happening in Ukraine and the potential impact of that on world grain availability. And of course, you know, when you start talking about oil and the impact of oil on packaging and distribution and other logistics, and when you start putting all of those sanctions together, it's well beyond just the grain that is grown in the Ukraine, which is massive in its own right. So will this conversation change? I could certainly be convinced that we will see a very large uptick in the price of food. We're already seeing it on the futures market. And that might change people's view back towards value rather than values. But I think it's probably, it will probably be short-lived. I think we would be really naive to think people are not going to focus on ethical requirements. And certainly here in New Zealand, where the rural community is such a small part of our total community, and the average urbanite is probably 2 and maybe more generations removed from how their food is produced, we've got to make sure we maintain that social license by what we do as well.
Yeah. Just along those lines, do you think that our markets overseas will begin to change based on the importation of supplements?
The markets,
the perception of our milk. Do you think that the future marketing of our milk will become important, whether there are supplements imported and fed or not?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Sorry, how do I not be too general about this? I think our processors are aware that there are markets for different types of milk that we can produce, and certainly pasture-based milk is regarded by a number of markets, discerning consumers, as being more animal friendly, possibly better for the environment, etc. There's a whole list of things that they will associate with that, and there will be an opportunity for our processors to probably segregate that type of milk and get a higher price for it. And then there will also, but not all of our milk will go into that market necessarily. And so there will be a market for milk that doesn't go into that niche as well. What I'm saying is, I suppose we are still regarded as pasture-based. The vast majority of our milk, we're still talking 80 to 85% of our milk comes directly from grazed pasture as a nation. So there's still no country that comes near us in terms of the scale, quality of product, and the amount of pasture that's in there. So I don't think that's really a limitation yet, but there are, and everyone has seen this, things like palm kernel, whether you believe the consumer is misconstruing the destruction of rainforests for palm with palm kernel doesn't really matter. If the consumer thinks it, then we've got to be cognizant of it. And so I think sorry, it's a really long answer because there isn't an actual definitive answer to this, Kim. I think there'll be a whole pile of opportunities for us to differentiate what we produce into different baskets and capture value add through that. And certainly in listening to Fonterra and what they've been doing and listening to the other processors as well, they're aware of that and they're working hard to see how they can capture that market.
I imagine it's quite challenging from a collection and processing point of view, you know, at the very least, if not anything else.
Depending on what they want to do, absolutely. So if you, if you wanted only milk that was produced only from pasture, then you'd probably target some of your plants to produce the products for that from particular regions where you had the greatest opportunity to make that happen. I'm not sure. There's a reason I'm not in the senior leadership team of Fonterra. I don't have the brain power. So just along those lines, I'll actually let Nathan ask his question directly, because I botched up last time he tried to ask one. So Nathan, do you want to just ask John your question?
G'day, John. Hey, just on the nature of New Zealand pastoral products, how we export it and trade them, we deemed as kind of a wholesale commodity trader. If we actually look at where we are now, our wholesale commodities are actually at the premium end of the scale of the market as it is. So how long can we sustain that position in the market for? And if we want to capture any additional value through a heading like Regen Ag, what mechanisms have to be in place for us to actually achieve that? And where, in your position, like personally or under the ministry, do we need accreditation going forward for a principle like that to actually gain that extra value in the marketplace?
So farmers that I've talked with don't want an accreditation for regenerative agriculture. Look, and I'm not saying that's all farmers, but I have talked with a fairly substantial number of farmers about this that are interested in regenerative agriculture, but don't want an accreditation because they don't want to be labeled into a prescriptive farming box. What they want to be able to do is pick and choose evidence-based practices. So that was a key thing. This wasn't a fad to them. They wanted to make sure that there was evidence that the practice would have the outcome that was promised, and whether that's reduced greenhouse gas footprint, more carbon in the soil, or better water quality, whatever. They wanted the evidence, but they wanted to be able to pick and choose the practices that would fit best into their system. So an accreditation system would restrict that. A national accreditation system would restrict that. Now, if you look at some of the, well, actually the vast majority of our primary product processors now, they all have varying degrees of this, Nathan. New Zealand Merino has the ZQRX, where they've got, I can't remember whether it's 10 or 12 characteristics that their farmers are assessed against. And the better they are, what the farmer can then see is how they score on each of those characteristics, whether it's their carbon footprint or their animal welfare metrics, etc. And they can see where they score and where they could improve. And so it's a journey for them to be on. And again, the people I've talked to about it have been quite excited that it's visual. They know where they can improve, and there are tools to help them improve in those ways. So I think it'll be up to individual companies to take advantage of the marketplace through their own accreditation or own guarantee to their customers, rather than actually setting up a national accreditation system. That's just a personal view. We certainly haven't had conversations about setting up a national accreditation system. But on your point, how do we? So absolutely, there's a good reason why our products are regarded in that quality, because that's what we demand. That's what our farmers demand, and that's what our farmer-owned processors demand that we produce. So we have the highest quality food, that outside aisle of the supermarket. What a piece of work that we're looking to do is, what do we need to do to punch into that Regen Ag market? So if our products are meeting those consumer ideals, What is stopping our processors and our product salespeople from actually capturing a premium in the marketplace on the business? So that's some market research that we want to do, and we want to do with the large food and fiber producers in New Zealand. So I don't have an answer for you on that, just to watch this space, but there is a number of them that are actively working in this space.
I've got a supplementary if you don't mind, Kim.
Yep, all good.
On that basis, you're doing the market research on that, getting into that regen space and trying to capture that value. Is it not in the best interest currently to try and delay implementing that until we need to, as opposed to going after it right now? Or do we really need to capture that space and be the first people in there to actually try and stamp and put the standards down? Because where we capture our premium prices currently, and we're world leading, we've got really high prices right now. What's the rush to go in and try to actually, dull the knife of what we have to try and keep the blade fresh for later on?
Yeah, look, there's a couple of reasons there. I think if you might not have noticed that slide on my last the quote on my last slide is, even if you're on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there. And momentum is important. Moving forward is important. And I think we've seen some fantastic initiative by some primary sector industries, even in recent times, to capture a niche market like zero carbon red meat, for example. By capturing that, and by having our brand, and by our I mean collectively New Zealand brand, but certainly a company brand, recognized for that. As you know, people go to the supermarket to buy a particular product rather than an item from a group of products. The discerning consumer doesn't go down. I'm trying to think of an example here, but the sales of Coca-Cola versus the sales of home brand cola. When somebody goes in to buy Coke in a shop, terrible example, but they're going to buy Coke, not cola. I think, once people want to buy low carbon, sustainable products, etc., and recognize it for what it is. And I don't know if you saw in one of those earlier slides, sustainable packaging was top of the list for both New Zealand and overseas consumers. So what Fonterra have done with their plant-based bottles, I think again is an extraordinary leap forward in terms of us being able to capture markets that, there are other people in that space with us, but we've got a point of difference. So sorry, again, a really long answer, but you guys are probably used to me giving long answers to short questions. I think by capturing that space, by defining the narrative, we've got an advantage going into the future. So there is a reason to be there first.
John, just picking up on that zero carbon product, that really gets on my goat when people say that, because it's actually not zero carbon product, it's 100% offset carbon product. The biggest part of that gets up my goat is when the transport industry says that they're reducing emissions and zero carbon airplane flights, but it's actually not. They're buying farms and planting trees. Politically, where do you see that heading? Really all that's doing is buying time. What we need is for the transport industry, particularly when it's just for pleasure, they're not producing food, there's just people going on holiday. Should there not be some political pressure there for them to actually reduce their emissions rather than buying up all our food producing farms and planting trees to offset? Like, where are we heading with that?
So look, well, I think we probably need to avoid the hyperbole of them buying up all of our food producing farms, because that's not happening, and there are regulations in train to make sure that is not a feature of our future. But I agree with you, and it's one of the reasons why when I talk to farmers about meeting our greenhouse gas obligations, I'm not concerned. I mean, now I'm fortunate in that I can see the science that's going on. I know where our footprint is, and I know the technologies or the changes we can make to get very close, if not meet our targets, so that offsetting is a smaller part of our bill. I'd rather be in our situation than in Waka Kotahi situation or transport situation, trying to electrify the entire fleet of cars in New Zealand over the next 20 to 30 years. I mean, they've got extraordinary challenges. And of course, they need to get the electricity to do that as well. So there's a whole infrastructure that has to be built nationally to achieve those aims. So I agree with your point in principle. We won't win this by offsetting. In fact, we need to get our gross carbon emissions, our gross warming impact. That's the other thing I want people to talk more about is what's the warming impact rather than our carbon emissions. Now, that has been taken into account in our Climate Change Act by recognizing that methane is a short-lived gas and therefore it doesn't need to drop to zero like the other two long-lived gases. So, you know, people tell me we need to use GWP star rather than GWP. It's an academic argument because we've already taken care of that in our legislation. But that is the conversation we need to have with consumers is about the warming impact, and that the warming impact of ruminant products from New Zealand is far lower than the vast majority of our competitors. And I am very confident in both our science and farming industries collectively, we can bring it lower. And we can meet our international obligations for New Zealand Inc. and provide the world with incredibly wholesome, low warming impact food.
So are you talking meeting targets from technology, not meeting targets from dropping stock numbers?
Well, technology first. I think that opportunity is there. There may be some drop in stock numbers in some places. There may be for other reasons, Kim. You know, as you know, you guys have seen the change in climate in parts of Northland over the last 10 to 15 years, and you know, is that conducive to continuing a pasture-based dairy system? In some parts, obviously not suggesting for a second that Northland shouldn't be a big dairy producing region into the future. But I think, you know, there's going to be parts of the country that will struggle more than they have in the past, and maybe an alternative enterprise or even another enterprise alongside dairy may be something that if individual farmers want to try themselves. I think there'll be opportunities, you know, the offsetting. Yes, I understand your point about, you know, wall-to-wall radiata pine. Nobody wants that. You know, it's a good export product. It's got huge potential for us to grow in value in New Zealand and export product overseas as well. So we don't want to see an end to our radiata pine, but we certainly don't want a large tracts of land being purchased just for carbon farming like you're suggesting. But you know, we're seeing an improvement in predictive technologies that farmers use alongside their advisors to identify areas of the farm that aren't producing very well from a milk production perspective. They could be hotspots for a phosphorus or nitrogen loss perspective, and we actually retire those into native biodiversity. We capture biodiversity benefits, we capture regenerative benefits, we capture carbon benefits, and we don't lose a lot of milk production. So I think it'll be a mixture of things, but I am very, very confident that we will have technologies. For example, the technology that Ravensdown released, you know, 3 or 4, 6 months ago, the eco pond or clean pond technology, whatever it's called. You know, approximately 5% of our methane on a dairy farm comes off the effluent pond on average across the country. We now have a technology that takes that to zero. That's 5% of our methane gone. So yeah, I'm very bullish about this. I'm very upbeat about this, and you know, I see a lot. So I don't think I'm being overly naive about this.
So just following on from your perspective, from where you are, non-replacement calves. There's been a couple of questions about that. Farmers are quite aware of the problem, the challenge. They're just not sure how we're going to deal with it.
Yeah, look, I had a conversation with a farmer this morning about just that. He rang me up quite frustrated. It's on farm, I know only too well that this is not something you can click your fingers and do on farm. So it's at a busy time of the year where labor is already stretched in a tight labor market, and now there's a significant additional workload put on top of you. So I see that argument. I also see the other side of this, where rightly or wrongly, consumers will have an aversion that an animal is being born to die, not being born for interproductive purposes. So that's obviously a decision for the company themselves. They've made that decision on the back of what they know about their markets, and I trust them to know their markets very, very well. But I think there is, there is certainly a need for Dairy NZ and the other supporting organizations to get their heads together to see how can we make that happen on farm.
Yeah.
And we'd certainly welcome being part of that conversation.
The good thing is that I think most farmers, it's an area that they would love to change. It's not going to be a hard one. As soon as there's opportunities for them, they will change. Karen, it's not peanut butter, it's peanut spread. Sorry, why you're asking that question. And it's almond juice, not almond milk. John, where do you see genetic modification technology in the future? Is it, we've got to feed, gazillions more people with protein. We're sort of stubbornly holding out. Where do you see that coming in the future here?
Look, I think so. There's two sides to this. There's two opinions that genetic modification will solve all of our problems, but by being genetic modification free, New Zealand will command a premium in its products. Neither of those is probably right, and neither of those is probably wrong. So I think it's time for a mature conversation. The Royal Commission is a long time ago. It's over 20 years ago now. The technology has moved on a long way. Both our competitors and our collaborators have moved their regulations a long way because of those changes in technology. This is still in New Zealand, it's still regulated under the Has No Act, which is a 1998 act, 1998, I think. So I think we need to have a mature conversation nationally about what advantages will genetic modification bring, and what are the challenges that it may bring as well. Laws made in haste make bad laws. My father once told me that when I complained about the speed at which governments move, and that's absolutely true. So this is, yes, it's a technology we can take off the shelf, but there are potential perverse outcomes to using that technology as well. So that's why. So short answer to your question is, I think we're now in a place where we can probably have that conversation. It's important to have, and certainly a number of us are wondering how we can start that conversation in a serious way. It's never ended, but it's in its backroom corridors. We actually need to bring that conversation out. But importantly, Kim, and you guys will understand this perfectly, this is a conversation for the heart. This is a conversation for the why. Why would we use this technology? We would use this technology to reduce our greenhouse gas footprint. We would use this technology to reduce our loss of nutrients to water, to reduce our need for nitrogen, to reduce our need for other elements. So therefore, there's a why. I'm not sure if any of you follow Simon Sinek as a thinker, but that's his mantra, is you begin with why. Let's not have the conversation about what could we do with genetic modification, because that doesn't speak to a person's heart, it speaks to their head. And most people don't think with their head, they think with their heart.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it, actually. And I think the attitudes towards it have changed a lot in the last 20 years too. I think people are more accepting of new things, whereas 20 years ago they weren't. So
absolutely, that's exactly right. And more people understand. We've now got We've now got a vaccine for COVID that, an RNA vaccine, first of its type, but not a new technology. I do want to stress that. But an incredible move, again, leap forward in how we can use genetic technologies for good.
Yeah. Terence, that's the end of the written questions. So I'll hand it over to you if you want to open up to the floor.
Well, Terence had a question there as well, is how much is politics getting in the way of science-based solutions?
Well, I conveniently ignored his question. So.
Actually, I don't think, well, certainly I can only speak for the where I work, and it doesn't. In fact, we pride ourselves as a ministry on being science-based, being evidence-based, and it's not the only thing that is taken into consideration. That's absolutely true, but it is a huge part of the discussion in policy decisions and in operational decisions, certainly within MPI, and I know in a lot of the other ministries. Now, what we've got to remember, I'm not sure where you're coming at that question from, Terence, is so the biophysical sciences are not the only sciences that should be feeding in to decision-making processes. The social science, the marketing science, the consumer insights need to come into those decision-making. And so, where if we went back 20, 30 years, we would have been very heavily driven by, does it grow more grass? Does it produce more milk, etc.? There is now another lens there going, what is that soy latte drinking individual in Ponsonby going to think about what we're doing? That social science part is incredibly important. And even more importantly, what is that cheese eating person in Europe or Asia or America going to think about that addition to our production arsenal? So I think so sometimes we may see that as politicking, but I don't. It is another part of the science system.
So then that goes to my previous question that Kim has not asked, is the industry keeping pace? Are we moving fast enough in the direction that we need to head to classify ourselves as regen agriculture and satisfy those science faculties across the board?
Look, some farmers are, Terence. Well, actually, let's be careful here. There's things that we don't know. So MPI is funding a very large portfolio of research, and obviously, despite the fact what's happening in NARF predates that Regen Ag call, we're still watching that really interestingly because it's a component of that Regen vision. We've just announced that we're funding Waimate West Dem Farm to look at diverse pastures versus perennial ryegrass white clover in dry coastal southern Taranaki. And there's another couple that I can't talk about. I'd be very happy to come back and talk about in a month or two's time once we got contracts signed. And one of the great things is, which we hasn't happened, and I believe in the past, maybe I'm wrong in that, or maybe I'm overstating it, is we are really managing it as a portfolio, and all of the different projects we've got, we're asking the groups that are undertaking them to undertake similar measures so that we can actually have that crosstalk, we can have that cross learning. Now that we live in a virtual world like this, we can have virtual conferences and bring all of those different research and demo farms together once or twice a year to talk about what we're doing, what we've uncovered, etc. So, but some of multiple of the projects we're looking at are obviously diverse pastures, and what should constitute a diverse pasture, and does it make any difference relative to ryegrass white clover? Now, we know that plantain does. Some really good work done over the last 10 to 15 years. Are there other plants that may be better, or in combination with plantain would have an additional effect? That's what we really want to understand, but we don't know. So therefore, I wouldn't be asking a farmer to go out and plant all of their farm like that. But hopefully in the next number of years, we're going to have the evidence that allows farmers to actually make a decision on whether they want to incorporate different types of plants. Just like you will have some really good information coming out of NARF for Northland. So are farmers moving fast enough? I think some farmers are moving at breakneck speed. I mean, there's some great high profile stories of farmers, developing wetlands, returning low productivity areas of their farm to native bush and things like that, making changes that will reduce their nitrogen and greenhouse gas footprint. And then there's the other end of the bell curve as well that are absolutely resisting any of those changes because we already produce low carbon milk and we should be left alone. I mean, that to me is unfortunate. But as with every revolution that's come through, those people will tend to get left behind or get regulated to a point where they have to change. We like to think of ourselves as the regulator of last resort. We really like to partner first. Let's see what we can do together, but we have acts of parliament to uphold. And if people aren't prepared to obey the law or work to achieve what we need to under those laws, then unfortunately we also have to regulate. But as you know, Terence, I mean, you look around your neighbors, they're the minority of the farmers that government has to step in with a heavy hand.
Yeah, thanks, John, and good to see that Northland's leading the way in research and influencing other projects that are being applied for. Hey,
Kim is going to blame me for that as well.
Hey, there's a question there around regenerative ag and GM. Where do the two sit?
It's a great question. I think that's part of that conversation that needs to be had. So really interestingly, my first conversation with a large group of arable farmers, primarily arable farmers, there was sheep and beef guys there as well, but primarily arable farmers, was their words, not mine, they can't farm regeneratively without glyphosate, without Roundup. And so one of their greatest concerns is that if Roundup were to be curtailed or reduced or removed, then they would have to go back to disking or plowing paddocks to control weeds, etc. So to them, glyphosate is the lesser of the evils of the system. And so I think, again, that conversation around genetic modification is, what is the trait that we want and why would we want that trait? And if the production of that and the extension and use of that is a no-brainer from a sustainability, consumer health, food quality, food safety, and profitability perspective. But let's again remember, we're talking to the hearts. So of course, if it increases production and reduces environmental footprint, then it likely reduces the cost of food as well. So these are all parts of the broader conversation that I think we need to have. I know I'm starting to sound like a politician now that I'm not answering the question, but it's a part of the conversation that has to be had.
Yeah, correct. Hey, Nathan's posted a question there. So Nathan, would you just like to ask your question?
G'day again. I just, in your opinion, what percentage of current pastoral farmers would meet the current definition of regenerative agriculture?
Like Nathan, I'm really glad you asked that, because it allows me to clarify, if in case I misrepresented my words. What I put up for you wasn't a definition, and that was exactly because the farmers didn't want a definition. What they wanted, and again, like I said, this wasn't all farmers, but it was at least a reasonable representative group. They wanted recognition that regenerative ag in New Zealand was a journey, and that you probably never got to an end point. And so, if our farming practice, I'm going to pull a number out of the air here, but if our farming practice today is leaking 40 kilos of nitrogen, and we can implement changes that will drop that to 30 to 33 kilos of nitrogen, is that now meeting a definition? It may well be, depending on the company that you're supplying, but for the farmers that I've talked to, and I have to tell you, these are profit-driven farmers as well as sustainability. So this is not, this is not the far end of the bell curve in terms of ideas. They're profit focused, but their attitude would be, right now you've got to 33. How do we get to 25? So it's a journey rather than a definition. So what percent of New Zealand pastoral ag would meet current? I have absolutely no idea, but in those farmers' views, none of them meet a definition, because they should all be on a journey of improvement in animal welfare, to Kim's point around calves, reduced nitrogen loss, reduced greenhouse gas footprint, both of the farm and of the per kilo of milk, etc. So again, I realize as I'm listening to myself, I know I'm sounding like a politician here, but I'm just reiterating what farmers were really clear to me. No definition, because again, it puts a perimeter fence around what we're doing, and no accreditation, because and one of the conversations that I've had with some of the farmers that have really disagreed with the term regenerative agriculture was their belief that if they didn't get on board with me, then I would regard them as degeneratives rather than regeneratives. That's not the case. What we're allowing for here is all farmers are on a journey. Some are going faster than others, to your question, obviously, or to Terence's earlier question as well. But we're all on that journey, and we'll go at different paces. We'll use different practices to achieve the outcomes that we want to, of better water quality, lower greenhouse gas footprint, better communities, and better farmer welfare, better products for our consumers.
Yeah, so thanks for that, John. And out of that answer comes another one of your famous quotes: regenerative ag is not an end point, but it's a journey. And the analogy to that probably is farm development. We're all at different stages, and we never get there because there's always something else to do. Hey, time's moving on, and what I'll do is I'll take, there's one more question there from Alistair, and then if anybody else has got a burning question, can you type it through, and then we'll head off and close. So Alice's question is, if predicted temperature rises occur, does that mean the end of temperate species in Northland as we know it?
It's a really good question, Alistair. And I don't have a firm answer for you on this. So let me explain why I don't have a firm answer. I think water availability would probably have a bigger impact than temperature per se. And that will probably vary, but on average, we've seen a 10 to 15% reduction in annual rainfall across Northland over the last 10 to 15 years. Again, don't quote me on those statistics, but it's not a good trajectory anyway. And that concerns me for some of our traditional temperate species, which are shallow rooted. Now, where the temperature has a significantly negative impact, and of course is compounded by a lack of water, is your C3 grasses tend to go dormant, and the hotter that temperature and the increased length of and frequency of hot days through that January-February period, the longer that dormancy as we head into autumn. So they become less of a contributor to the pasture. Now they're, my experience is they're of limited contribution anyway when you're thinking of a very strong kikuyu stand in many parts of Northland anyway. The caveat to that is the modeling I've seen done is that the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a fertilizer that at least compensates to a degree for increasing temperatures. So that was my reason for not being able to give you a straight answer. As temperatures increase, temperate species will come under pressure. The higher carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is certainly alleviating some of that. It also will make those plants more moisture efficient, because it impacts on the stomata of the plants where they lose their water. But even so, I think the temperature and reduction in rainfall is increasing at too great a level to be compensated for by carbon dioxide. And so I think alternatives will become a greater part of our future in the upper north. It's not just Northland. I think, you know, the Waikato, Western Bay of Plenty, anything north of Taupo is starting to mimic Northland in most of these now.
Yeah, thank you, John. We haven't had any more questions come through. Would anybody like to ask a question directly, verbally? Okay. All right. Well, thank I always get the last say, John. Hey, no, thanks, John. And it's interesting the comments about diminishing rainfall. I was having a discussion a couple of months ago with a farmer, an older farmer, and we were talking about the lack of big cyclones that we actually haven't had. You know, we used to have, it was quite predictable to have these big cyclones with 200 mil plus rainfalls. And we actually haven't had that in the last 10 years, you know, of any form of regularity. So whether that's the type of rainfall we're missing out on, or whether it's the 10 and 20 mils that add a lot of value, I don't know. And whether we're in a cycle or not, I don't know.
It's probably both turns. Those big cyclone events tend to recharge underground aquifers, etc. And I mean, there's a number of communities that you will know better than me that have really struggled with just drinking water over the last several years. And you know, that is a priority for us as well. You know, we are thinking about that, and we are thinking about Northland, and in particular Northland and even Te Rāwhiti as being, you know, key regions where water security into the future is something that we need to focus on. Yeah,
good point. All right. Well, there is a question. Do you think the current situation? This very quick answer, John. Do you think the current situation driving high milk price is a bubble waiting to burst, or do you see longer term stability?
Yeah, I don't think it's a bubble waiting to burst. You know, so there was a bubble in 2013, and it's easy to be wise in retrospect. But you know, when we look backwards, all of the signals were there. Those same signals aren't there now. There isn't, as I mentioned earlier, there's no evident stockpiling of dairy products so that a major purchaser will step out of the market. Oil price is so high, and there's a really strong correlation between the price of oil and the price of milk, because the collective oil producing nations are very large purchasers of milk. When you look at the supply upside, it's small relative to the demand upside. So I would foresee that there's a large, and actually, as well as that, when you think that the vast majority of the milk that competes with us is produced from a grain base, and grain prices have gone through the roof, our competitors have become even less competitive price-wise against us. But we need to be careful that we don't get caught up in the inflationary trap that's also happening in that space. And because as we saw, you know, 2013, 2014, costs that we dial into our system are incredibly hard to pull out when we have to. So look, I'm seeing some good behaviors. I've seen a lot of farmers paying down debt, or you know, not taking out debt despite the milk price. And so I think we're in a really good place.
I agree with you, John. Thank you. And I think that's a great ending to tonight's session. And bearing in mind that that little clip was recorded and may come back to bite you. So, no, look, hey, it's been a great evening, John. I've certainly enjoyed it, and the insights that you provide. So, no, excellent evening. Thanks very much, and hope to see you in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks.